Homeless man bought a storage unit full of trash, and what was hidden inside reversed his destiny. Jake was homeless, lost in the streets of a large American city. But everything changed when he found something that none of us would imagine a simple storage unit auction could offer. He only had a few coins in his pocket and a desperate idea, but what he found inside that box wasn't just trash. No, what Jake discovered was about to turn his world upside down and transform his life forever. It was a find that started as a pile of broken furniture and old papers, but upon opening an old box of documents, Jake stumbled upon something much bigger than he could imagine. Evidence of a real estate corruption scandal involving powerful people. And what would he do with this discovery? Would he keep it all to himself, or would he change the course of his life and many others by bringing this hidden truth to light? But what Jake didn't know was that this simple discovery would come with a high price. He began to be pursued by mysterious people, willing to do anything to recover what he had found. What started as a simple auction transformed into a dangerous journey of justice and redemption. Jake woke up to another day under a gray and stuffy sky. The streets were his home, and he had long ago lost count of the days, weeks, and months he spent there. Each dawn, a battle. The smell of the city mixed with the clothes he hadn't changed in days, and the echo of hurried pedestrians passing by was nothing but a distant memory of a time that already seemed to be from another life. He didn't have much, but still, something inside him insisted on keeping hope alive. Perhaps it was the need to believe that somewhere, destiny still had something good in store for him. Life on the streets was hard. Jake knew this, and every day was a challenge to survive. With the little he managed to earn from temporary jobs and sparse donations he got by, there was no luxury or comfort, but there was the feeling of being alive, and for Jake, that was already something precious. The city, with its relentless indifference, seemed to treat him as if he were invisible. He was nobody to others, and most of the time he felt invisible even to himself. The streets offered him a kind of freedom, or at least that's what he told himself. Deep down, Jake knew that this freedom came with an immense weight, loneliness and fear of tomorrow. But there was something that always gave him strength to keep going. Max, his faithful dog, was always by his side. Max wasn't just a pet. He was, in fact, the only friend Jake had in a world where he felt like a ghost. The dog, with his brown fur and expressive eyes, seemed to understand Jake in a way that no one else did. Together they wandered the streets, sharing the same struggles, the same moments of silence, and the few joys that street life could offer. Max was the closest thing to family that Jake had, and in a way he was what made him continue, even on the hardest days. Jake's life, to most people, might seem worthless. He didn't have a home, didn't have family, didn't have a steady job or a clear future, but inside him Jake carried a faint flame of hope. Perhaps it was this hope that led him to continue waking up every morning, even when everything seemed to conspire against him. The desire for change, for a better future, had always been present. It was a flame that burned inside him. But at the same time, this flame was fragile. It could go out at any moment with one wrong step, one night too cold, or a new disappointment. Life on the streets taught Jake many things, but it also took many others from him. He learned to be resilient, to survive with the minimum, and to hide in the shadows when necessary. But more than anything, he learned that life, in its rawest form, made no promises. It guaranteed nothing, except the constant struggle for survival. And it was in this scenario, in this corner of the world where hopes always seemed to be on the edge of the abyss, that something unexpected happened. Jake saw an advertisement. He was sitting in a square with Max lying beside him, when something on a crumpled cardboard sign caught his attention. It was an advertisement about a storage unit auction. At first, he just glanced at it, without paying much attention. Auctions? He didn't have nearly enough to compete in an event like that. But then, something inside him made him look back at that piece of paper. Something inside Jake whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment to give destiny a chance. He had nothing to lose. Perhaps this was the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. And that's how Jake, with his nearly empty pocket and a handful of coins, decided to take a bold step. Perhaps the universe had something for him. Perhaps the box of surprises that he felt his life was, had something hidden, waiting to be discovered. But before anything else, he looked at Max. The dog seemed to understand that something was about to change, and as always, was by his side. The storage unit auction advertisement didn't seem like a big deal to those looking from the outside. It was just a simple opportunity, without glamour. But for Jake, it seemed to be everything he needed at that moment. He was tired of waiting. His life, up to that point, had been a constant struggle, but there was always the feeling that something was missing, something that could transform everything. The metaphor of the box of surprises took shape in his mind. His life, like that storage box, was full of things that seemed worthless at first glance. What Jake didn't know was that, just like the boxes at that auction, inside himself there was something hidden, something precious, that he hadn't yet discovered. What he didn't imagine was that that simple auction of dusty objects could be the beginning of a silent revolution in his life. As the sun set on the horizon, Jake stood up, took the coins he had, and prepared to face the auction. He didn't know what he would find there, but inside him a small flame of hope began to shine. It was the kind of flame that could, or could not, go out at any moment. But at that instant, Jake knew one thing. He was about to do something big. He was about to open a new door in his life, and maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of the transformation he so desired. Jake walked slowly through the streets, his head full of conflicting thoughts. The image of the advertisement he had seen in the square was still vivid in his mind. The storage unit auction. He didn't know exactly what it meant, but part of him felt it was something important. For someone who had nothing but his dog and a handful of coins, the idea of risking something so uncertain seemed almost insane. But deep down, he knew he needed to do something. He needed to try. He stopped in front of an alley, leaned against a cold wall, and closed his eyes for a moment, thinking. Jake's life had always been like this, a series of small leaps of faith, where he bet his last strength on something that, often, didn't work out. But at that instant, something inside him said that this would be a different chance. He couldn't let it pass. Maybe it was destiny knocking at his door, or maybe it was just the madness of his condition, but Jake felt a flame lit inside him. A flame he thought had gone out long ago. He looked at Max, who was lying on the sidewalk beside him, with attentive eyes and wagging tail, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Jake stroked his head. "Let's go, Max," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "We're about to change everything, or at least try." At that moment, Jake made what was perhaps the boldest decision of his life. He stood up and, with a deep sigh, headed to the auction address, determined to participate. With the small amount he had, there wasn't much to lose. Life on the streets had already taught him that no matter how much you have in hand, it's always possible to lose everything at once. He had nothing more to lose. Upon arriving at the location, Jake observed the scene around him. The atmosphere was far from glamorous. The auction was a small gathering of people with serious looks and closed expressions. He felt a bit out of place, as if he were an intruder in a place he shouldn't be. But at the same time, there was a feeling of excitement growing inside him. This was his moment, the moment to do something different. He had few coins in his pocket, but if he was going to risk it, let it be with what he had. While waiting for the auction to start, he wondered how this event worked. How could he compete with people who probably had much more money than he did? But then, an internal voice, a voice that had always been there but now seemed stronger than ever, reminded him of the reason he was there. He wasn't there to compete with others. He was there because he believed this could be his chance to change everything. He didn't need much, just an opportunity. And this could be his. The auction began, and Jake listened attentively as the first lots were sold. Each storage unit seemed to be a pile of old and unimportant objects, but Jake couldn't help feeling there was something more there, something he needed to discover. The auction proceeded, and with each sale made, he felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. He knew that at any moment it would be his turn. When the moment came for the lot he was watching, something inside him fired. The storage unit was being sold for an amount that Jake, until that moment, didn't believe was possible. The value was low, much lower than he imagined. He had enough to participate, and although it was a small amount, it seemed to be a unique opportunity. Nervousness consumed him, but the will to do something, to try something new, was stronger. He placed his bid. Little by little, Jake realized that life for him had never been about having much. It wasn't about wealth or luxury. Life on the streets had given him something much more precious: the ability to fight with what he had, to make something out of nothing. He was taking a step in the dark, but he was already used to darkness. Doubt, fear, all of that was part of who he was now. The only difference was that this time, he didn't allow himself to be stopped by them. As the auction continued, Jake remained there with his heart racing, anxiously waiting to know if he had won. He didn't know what to expect, but the only thing he knew for sure was that night, something was about to change. He was making a decision that could change the course of his life, and even if everything went wrong, he knew he would have at least tried. He would no longer be the man who just watched the world from afar, but someone who dared to take the first step. Finally, the hammer fell. The auction was over, and with that, Jake knew he had won. He had secured a storage unit. Although the emotions that invaded him were mixed, between excitement and uncertainty, one thing was clear: he had taken the first step to change his life. Whatever was waiting for him in those boxes, Jake now had the chance to discover. With Max by his side, he prepared to face whatever was hidden inside the storage unit. He knew there were no guarantees. Life was never guaranteed. But at that moment, something inside him said that maybe this was the chance he had been waiting for, the chance that would change everything. When Jake arrived at the auction location, his heart was racing. Adrenaline propelled him, but at the same time he felt butterflies in his stomach. He knew he didn't have much to lose, but he couldn't imagine what could await him inside that storage unit. With a mixture of anxiety and expectation, he headed to the designated location. Max, as always, was by his side, observing everything with his attentive eyes, as if he knew that this scene was more important than it seemed. The storage unit was locked, and Jake needed a moment to digest the feeling of having conquered that space. He had placed the bid, not knowing exactly what he was buying. Inside him, a growing expectation took over his thoughts. What will I have found? What will this mean to me? He was determined to find out. That box, apparently banal, could be the turning point of his life. All he needed to do was open it and explore what was waiting for him. Upon opening the unit, Jake had an immediate impression. Everything there seemed to be pure dirt. The cold, impersonal light illuminated piles of old furniture, crushed cardboard boxes, and broken pieces of wood. There was something desolate about it all, and for a moment Jake felt almost discouraged. There was nothing there that seemed valuable. He took a deep breath and looked around. It was as if he were facing a metaphor of his own life, full of broken, chaotic, and senseless things at first glance. It was as if the universe were testing Jake, asking if he had what it took to see beyond the surface. First impressions can be deceiving. He knew this, and yet something inside him insisted on continuing. Max by his side seemed to perceive what Jake was thinking. The dog didn't move away from his leg, and with a slight movement of his tail, seemed to give support, as if saying, "Don't give up now." Jake wasn't a man to give up. He knew that deep down, life had always been full of surprises, and the best things usually came disguised as challenges. He began to rummage through the cardboard boxes and, among the piles of useless objects, found an old broken chair and a pile of books that seemed moldy and discarded. At first, what he saw didn't seem to have any value. There was something frustrating about it all, as if he were deceiving himself once again, betting his last savings on something that wouldn't be worth it. But something compelled him to continue. He needed, somehow, to make that moment meaningful. Perhaps deep down he knew that, like his life, that storage unit was full of underestimated things. He knew he would need to look more closely, beyond the trash in front of him, to find what was really worthwhile. When Jake dug deeper, something caught his attention. An old wooden box buried under the piles of apparently worthless objects. It was different from the other boxes, more resistant, more solid, as if it were hiding something important. His curiosity was instant. He began to open the box carefully, already expecting but not knowing exactly what to expect. The feeling he had was almost magical, as if something was about to happen. Inside the box, there were more old papers and yellowed documents, but something stood out. A letter with an unusual signature and a series of documents apparently linked to a large real estate transaction. Jake had no idea what it meant. But when looking at the papers, a feeling of disbelief took over him. There was something more here. They weren't just old things, they weren't just broken furniture and old books. There, hidden under layers of useless objects, was something much bigger, something that could change his life and, perhaps, even the lives of other people. He examined the documents more carefully. The papers were related to a real estate corruption scandal that had occurred years ago, involving the sale of stolen properties and a series of powerful figures, including a woman named Olivia Grant. The story behind those papers was more complex than Jake could imagine. He didn't understand all the details, but there was something there that seemed to be the key to a great revelation. At that moment, Jake had a clear vision. He had found something much bigger than he could have imagined. He wasn't just looking for old objects or broken furniture. He was facing a hidden secret, something that had been buried there for a reason. For an instant, the disillusionment he had felt when looking at the storage unit dissipated, and he found himself facing an unexpected truth. What seemed to be just trash was, in fact, full of potential. The real surprise was there, waiting to be discovered. Jake felt a mixture of emotions: disbelief, fear, excitement. He didn't know what to do with those discoveries, but he knew he had something powerful in his hands. He couldn't simply leave that behind. At first it seemed that the storage unit auction had been a useless bet, but now he understood that there was something much deeper at stake. Those papers, those documents, could be the key to reversing a great injustice, an injustice that affected powerful people. And perhaps Jake was the only person capable of doing something about it. Max, always by his side, seemed to perceive the gravity of the situation. The dog approached and looked directly at Jake as if saying, "Now the game has changed. What are you going to do with this?" Jake didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear: his life was about to change forever. He knew he was facing a unique opportunity, something that could give meaning to his existence, something that could give him a chance to rewrite his own story. Jake was sitting on the floor of the storage unit, surrounded by piles of documents and broken boxes. The smell of mold and the stuffy environment contrasted with the growing feeling of euphoria and anxiety that dominated him. He ran his hands through the pile of yellowed papers, the sound of the sheets moving echoing in the silent room. Each piece of paper seemed to tell a part of a bigger story, a story that was there, waiting to be discovered. When he found the letter, something in his chest tightened. It was carefully folded, stuck in one of the folders, and the signature in the upper left corner seemed almost illegible, but still recognizable. He read it again, more carefully this time. The letter seemed to be an internal communication, but what caught Jake's attention was the name mentioned in it: Olivia Grant. He knew little about Olivia, but enough to understand that she was an important figure, a powerful woman who had been widely mentioned in reports of real estate scandals. Olivia Grant's name always appeared negatively, associated with fraud and scandals involving the sale of fraudulent properties and corruption actions. Jake, with his eyes fixed on the letter, felt a wave of surprise. He didn't expect to find something so direct, something that connected immediately with such a big story. But what really left him perplexed was the content of the letter. It spoke about the sale of valuable properties, with a tone that indicated an illicit transaction. What troubled him most, however, was the mention of a complex network of powerful and influential figures who were involved, figures who used their power to manipulate the real estate market and enrich themselves at the expense of innocent people. Jake stood there, motionless for a few seconds, processing what he had just read. He didn't know what to do with that information, but something inside him knew that this wasn't just any story. Those documents weren't just old and smoky papers. They were key pieces in something much bigger, something Jake would never imagine having the luck or misfortune to find. While still trying to digest what was before him, his eyes ran over other papers in the box. Each page he unfolded seemed to bring more and more details about the fraudulent transactions. One of the folders was full of records of sales of land and properties that had been bought at irregular prices, with falsified documents and altered records. There was even a city map, with marks indicating high-value areas that had been targeted by a macabre manipulation scheme. Jake ran his fingers over the pages, feeling a mixture of disbelief and fear. He realized that what he had found wasn't something simple. He wasn't just facing any fraud. He was facing a scandal that involved powerful people, individuals who had the resources and influence to hide the truth and destroy anyone who dared to expose it. As he continued sifting through the papers, Jake found something even more surprising: a list of names, among which was the name of a renowned businessman, a man who had always been portrayed as a model of integrity. Jake knew this man's name, and he knew he was among those involved. The name on the list left no doubt. It was more evidence that what he was holding in his hands wasn't a mere coincidence. Those pages were proof of a colossal scheme, involving people from all levels of society, from politicians to businessmen and community leaders. The penny dropped. Jake knew those documents had incalculable value. They not only told a story of corruption, but were also the key to revealing the truth behind years of manipulation and exploitation. He looked at Max, who was by his side, watching attentively. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, and Jake couldn't help thinking that somehow Max was the only being who was really with him at every step of this journey. Jake felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He knew he had something powerful in his hands, something that could put everything he knew at risk. He was aware that, if someone knew what he had found, his life would be in danger. The fear was real, and the idea of leaving there and throwing the documents away, forgetting everything, seemed tempting. But at the same time, there was a sense of responsibility growing inside him. He couldn't simply ignore that. He knew the truth needed to be revealed. He couldn't be just another person who passed through life without making a difference. He had to act, but how? The dilemma Jake faced wasn't small. He didn't know exactly what to do with those discoveries. Handing over the documents could mean a radical change in his life, but it could also mean the end for him, if those involved discovered that he possessed that information. But there was something more important than the fear of his own consequences. It was the idea of justice, the feeling that he, a homeless man of no importance to most of the world, could be the only person capable of changing something so big. Jake continued there, lost among the papers, immersed in a storm of thoughts. He didn't have all the answers, but now he knew that somehow he was a key piece in this game. And when looking at the papers, he couldn't help wondering, what happens now? Jake felt a growing tension in the air as he sifted through the documents and tried to understand the magnitude of the discovery. His mind was racing, processing information about a colossal fraud involving powerful figures from the government and the real estate sector. Each page he turned seemed to reveal more layers of an even more complex story, and the notion that he was holding proof of massive corruption seemed surreal. He was still alone in the storage unit, with Max by his side, but something in his chest said that this wasn't the kind of secret that would be kept for long. When Jake decided to take a break, getting up to stretch his legs and take a walk around the unit, something bothered him. He felt as if he were being watched. It was a strange feeling, as if someone were there, just a few meters away, waiting to suddenly appear. He looked around, but the unit was empty except for the piles of objects he had left scattered on the floor. He smiled to himself, trying to push away the feeling of paranoia that was beginning to settle in. But even so, the impression of being watched didn't go away. Max, always alert, suddenly stood up, growling softly. Jake frowned and approached the dog, trying to understand what was happening. Something was wrong. Max had never reacted that way, especially in a place like that, where noise and movement were limited. Jake then realized that, in the distance, there was a shadow moving at the entrance of the storage unit. He approached discreetly, trying not to make noise, and looked through the crack in the door. What he saw made his heart race. There was a man standing at the entrance of the location, watching the storage unit Jake came from. The stranger seemed to be waiting, as if monitoring someone. He was dressed in common clothes, nothing that called attention, but the attentive look and vigilant posture indicated that he wasn't there by chance. Jake knew something wasn't right. The last thing he wanted was for someone to know what he had found, and if that man was keeping an eye on the unit, it only meant one thing. Someone knew he was there. Jake quickly backed away, making as little noise as possible. Max, still restless, followed his steps with the same tension. The dog knew something was happening, but Jake couldn't yet understand the extent of the danger that was beginning to unfold. He looked at the documents in his hands, the evidence of real estate fraud that could destroy the lives of many powerful people. He didn't know who was after him, but he knew he needed to act fast. The stranger at the entrance seemed to be waiting for something, but Jake had no intention of waiting to find out what it would be. He grabbed Max firmly, putting the dog on his leash, and began to leave the storage unit. He was sweating, his breathing accelerated. He knew things had changed. The feeling of security he felt being there, alone, with Max, disappeared in an instant. He was now being hunted. As Jake moved away from the entrance with the dog by his side, he realized he was no longer alone. The stranger at the door wasn't the only one. He could see in the distance other men walking toward the location. They were dressed discreetly, but the expression on their faces said it all. They were looking for something and probably knew that Jake had what they wanted. He felt a chill down his spine. What would he do now? Panic began to take over him, but Jake couldn't afford to despair. He thought quickly, looking around to find a way to escape without being seen. Fear grew inside him, but he also knew there was no turning back. The decisions he had made until now had led to this moment. He couldn't back down now. He had the documents, and the men following him wanted much more than a simple conversation. If he were caught with that evidence, his life would be at risk. Jake quickly began to walk in the opposite direction, trying to stay out of sight of the men who now surrounded him. He knew the city streets like the back of his hand, and he knew where he could hide. But the feeling of being pursued was something new to him. He who was once an invisible man to the world was now at the center of something much bigger, something he didn't even fully understand. Max, always by his side, seemed more alert than ever. Jake looked at the dog, as if seeking comfort in the only being he knew was really with him. They were together in this, and together they would get out of this situation. But what would happen when the truth was revealed? He didn't know, but he was determined to take the documents to the end to see how far he could go with this discovery. As he moved through the streets, trying to stay out of the line of sight, Jake couldn't help thinking about what was happening. Who were those people after him? Why were they so determined to get those papers? He knew they weren't just ordinary men. They had a mission, and their mission was clear: to find what Jake had found. The chase was in full swing, and Jake felt the pressure increasing with each step he took. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew his life would never be the same. The mysterious figures following him weren't just treasure hunters, they were hunters of a truth that, when discovered, could destroy everything they had built. And Jake, somehow, was the key to that truth. He was no longer alone. He was being followed, and his life was at risk. But Jake knew one thing. He couldn't turn back now. The choice was made, and whatever happened from there, he would face it with everything he had. Jake didn't know what to do with the documents. Fear, anxiety, and the pressure of being pursued by the mysterious men consumed him. However, something inside him said he couldn't keep running. He was caught between the desire to protect his life and the need to do the right thing. Those papers, the evidence of real estate fraud that had destroyed so many lives, were something he knew he couldn't simply ignore. He wasn't just facing a secret that affected the powerful. He was facing an opportunity to bring justice. But where would he deliver those documents? The answer, as simple as it seemed, came clearly. Emily Grant. She was Olivia's granddaughter, the woman behind the scandal. Emily, as far as Jake knew, was seeking justice for her grandmother and for all those who had been harmed by that corrupt scheme. It didn't make sense to leave the documents in the wrong hands, and Jake knew that if he delivered the evidence to Emily, he could finally do something that really mattered. Jake remembered Emily's name from the reports he had read in newspapers when he was still living on the streets. She was known for her fight against injustices and for trying to clear her grandmother's name. who, despite being a public figure, had been dragged to the bottom due to the corruption that involved her. She was determined to reverse what had happened to her family, but she didn't know how much her actions could change even the most powerful structures. The decision was made. Jake knew he couldn't keep running. He couldn't simply ignore the weight of the documents in his hands. He had been chosen for this mission, however unlikely it was. He wasn't a hero, but at that moment, he had the power to change the course of a story bigger than himself. The discoveries he had made could affect much more than his own life. They could affect the future of many people, and perhaps that was exactly what he needed to do to rewrite his own story. With Max by his side, he decided to head toward Emily Grant's address. The path seemed long and full of uncertainties, but what Jake felt now was different. For the first time, he wasn't running. He was going toward something bigger than himself, and that gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He was no longer the invisible man who lived in the shadows of the city. He had a mission, and that changed everything. Crossing the city streets, Jake passed through familiar places, but now everything seemed different. He saw the world from a new perspective, a perspective of someone who had discovered something far beyond what ordinary people could imagine. He was about to deliver something very powerful, something that could alter the lives of many people, and that made him feel more alive than ever. For the first time, he didn't feel powerless. He felt he could make a difference. Arriving at the building where Emily Grant lived, Jake hesitated for a moment. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing, if Emily would really understand the importance of those documents. But the doubt soon dissipated. He knew he had no other option. He couldn't leave the documents in his hands. They were calling to be used, to be delivered to the right person. Emily was home when Jake arrived. She didn't seem very surprised to see him. Perhaps she had heard about the discovery of new evidence. Perhaps she was expecting something like this. Destiny had been generous with Jake, allowing him to be the bearer of something so important. Emily looked at him with a serious expression, but also one of strange understanding. She knew Jake wasn't an ordinary man. He wasn't a hero, but he was about to be part of something much bigger. Jake handed the documents to Emily without saying a word. He knew he wouldn't need explanations. Emily was more than prepared to deal with that information. She knew this could be the key to finally clearing her grandmother's name, and, more importantly, to bringing justice. But, for Jake, that moment was much more than delivering papers. It was the beginning of his own transformation. He was no longer trapped in his old life of uncertainties and survival on the streets. He had taken a step forward, and the reward wasn't just the expectation of changing others' lives, but also the chance to change his own life. Emily read the documents attentively, and Jake realized she was absorbing the weight of those words, understanding the depth of everything written there. With each page she turned, Jake felt a weight being lifted from his shoulders. He knew that by delivering those documents, he was doing something of great importance. But what he didn't know was how his own life would begin to change. "I will never forget what you did for me, Jake," Emily said with a sincere look. She seemed genuinely touched. "You gave us the chance to fight for justice. This will change everything." Jake didn't respond immediately. He didn't know what to say. He was there, before a woman who now had in her hands the evidence that could reverse the entire scandal affecting her family. The fact that Jake was the key to this change gave him a sense of power he had never imagined feeling. It wasn't power over others, but over himself. He had taken a step toward what, for many, seemed impossible. The chance to redeem himself, to leave behind a life of invisibility and embrace something much bigger. With Emily now ready to act, Jake felt a growing peace inside him. He knew his journey was far from over, but somehow, he had already found what he was looking for. He had found his purpose. And that by itself was more valuable than anything he had imagined. Emily left to make the necessary contacts, taking the documents with her. Jake was alone for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about how life had led him to that point, how even in the darkest moments he had found the strength to change. He looked at Max, who was now by his side as always, offering him the same unwavering confidence. Jake didn't know what the future held for him, but there was something he now knew for sure. He would no longer be the same man as before. Life, as difficult as it had been, gave him the opportunity to rewrite his story, and he knew that, regardless of what happened, he had done the right thing. Jake was standing on the sidewalk, looking at the busy street ahead. The sun was beginning to set, and the city began to gain new life as night approached. However, for Jake, this wasn't just another end of the day. It was the beginning of something completely new. He had taken a courageous, risky step, but now, looking at the horizon, he felt something he had never felt before. Hope. His life on the streets, the constant struggle for survival, all of that now seemed distant. He knew he had nothing more to do with that homeless man who fought against invisibility, who went unnoticed by everyone. Jake was no longer a spectator of life. He was now an active participant, someone who had taken the reins of his destiny, and with that, changed the course of history. The moment he delivered the documents to Emily Grant was, for Jake, a turning point. Not only because he had done the right thing, but because he had somehow redeemed himself. He didn't know if the consequences of his actions would be positive or negative, but he knew that by choosing to do the right thing, he had given himself the chance to change. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew that at least he now had a purpose. The change wasn't immediate, and Jake knew that. He didn't expect everything to be resolved overnight, but he was beginning to see the fruits of his courage. Emily Grant, with the documents in hand, began to act. She contacted lawyers, did everything possible to bring the evidence to the press, and more importantly, began working to restore the justice that had been lost for so long. Jake wasn't at the center of the action, but he knew his choice had been the spark that started everything. Jake's reward didn't come in the form of money or material goods. He wasn't interested in riches. For him, the real reward was the impact his actions caused. Emily Grant, with the documents in hand, managed to reverse much of the damage caused by her grandmother's corruption and by those involved in the real estate scheme. The scandal that had destroyed many lives began to be dismantled, and the authorities finally began to act. Jake didn't know how much his discovery had changed history, but he knew that somehow he had been part of something bigger. Jake's true reward, however, was deeper than that. He was rewarded with an opportunity, the chance to rebuild his life. A few weeks after delivering the documents, Jake received an unexpected offer from Emily. She sought him out, not just to thank him, but to offer him an opportunity to start his life over. Emily knew that Jake, although not the typical hero, had acted heroically by putting his own life at risk to ensure justice was done. She wanted to reward him somehow, and, in doing so, she offered him more than a simple payment. She offered him the chance to have a new life. Jake received the proposal with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He knew he didn't deserve it, but he couldn't deny that he was being given something he would never have imagined. Emily offered him a simple but decent job in a foundation she had started to help people in vulnerable situations, like Jake. The work was the kind of opportunity he would never have imagined for himself. It was the chance to start over, to rebuild his life from scratch with dignity and purpose. Jake accepted the offer, but more than that, he accepted what it represented. It wasn't just a job. It was the chance to finally have a home, to have a dignified life, and perhaps one day be able to help others in the same way he had been helped. He didn't know what his journey would be like from that moment on, but he knew it would be different from everything he had known until then. Over time, Jake began to integrate into the work at the foundation, helping others who were in the same situation as him. He became an inspiration to many of those who, like him, had lost hope. But the most important thing was what Jake found within himself. He was no longer a homeless man, lost on the streets and invisible to society. He was now someone who had made a difference, someone who had acted, even when he didn't know what would happen next. Jake learned that sometimes life gives us opportunities disguised as challenges. That storage unit auction, which at first seemed to be an insane bet, had become the key to a new beginning. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that, with the decision he had made, he had finally taken the step he so needed to change his life. Max, his faithful companion, was by his side, as always. They now had a home, and more importantly, they had a purpose. Jake knew he didn't need much more than that. Max's love and loyalty, Emily's friendship and support, and the chance to rewrite his story were more than enough for him. He was no longer the man who lived in the shadows. He was someone who had faced fear and doubt, and who was now living his life with a new purpose and meaning. And so, Jake finally understood what it meant to be truly free. Freedom didn't come from having money or material possessions. True freedom came from the ability to change, to start over, to make a difference in the lives of others. He was no longer invisible. He had found his place in the world, and with that, he had found true redemption. Jake never imagined that a simple step toward change could have so much impact. But by deciding to do what was right, he not only altered the course of his own life, but also gave a chance for justice to be done, for the victims of the real estate scandal to finally see their rights restored. What began as a struggle for survival on the streets transformed into a journey of redemption and personal discovery. But Jake's story doesn't end here. What he did, as grand as it was, is just one part of life's great puzzle. There are other people, other moments, and other discoveries that are still waiting to be revealed. And while Jake now has the chance to start his life over, the real question is, who else like him can have the chance to change their story? Jake's journey is just one of many. On every corner of the city, on every unknown street, there are people living their own struggles, facing challenges, making difficult choices, and, sometimes, without even knowing they're about to make a decision that will change the course of their lives. What Jake learned, and what we can learn from him, is that true strength comes from within. Even in the darkest moments when everything seems lost, there exists the possibility of transformation. Sometimes all it takes is a moment of courage to change everything. Jake didn't do this for fame, recognition, or a material reward. He did it because he believed in what was right, and it's exactly this that he found. The purpose of his life, the chance to make a difference, to be someone who positively impacts the world. Now he is no longer a homeless man. He is someone who built a new life, with dignity and hope. And in the end, he wasn't the only one to transform. Those around him, like Emily Grant and even Max, his faithful dog, also found a new path. Jake's transformation is proof that, when you do what is right, you not only change yourself, but also the world around you. But who will be the next to take that step? Who else somewhere is about to discover that a simple choice can rewrite their entire story? Now, I invite you to continue following this journey of transformation. In the next video, you'll meet another inspiring story, where an unlikely hero just like Jake rises to face challenges that seem impossible to overcome. But just like him, this new protagonist will discover the power to change their own trajectory and impact the world in a unique way. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you ensure you won't miss any of the upcoming stories that bring the strength of overcoming and personal transformation. Click the subscribe button and activate the bell to stay on top of each new episode. Click now on the next video and discover how one more person, like you or like any of us, can find the necessary strength to change their life forever. Because sometimes the greatest discovery of all is the one we make of ourselves.